President Trump has spoken about the need of others to come together to try and secure the Strait of Hormuz. Was this discussed with NATO, and what's the latest?
Well, first of all, I think we now need to de-escalate rather than escalate. So what we probably need is peace mediation. The actual original operation was not discussed with allies, but I'm sure that President Trump is now in conversation with the UK, with France, Germany, the big players.
I think President Trump said that NATO faces a very bad future if US allies fail to assist. How should we take that?
Well, I think, we obviously have to take everything that the President of the United States says seriously. I think the key now is to focus on the alliance and what we do. We are a defensive alliance, which means that we don't do military attacks as such. We're 32 countries. Of course, after the Cold War, we had some peacekeeping missions, but they were always justified through international law and UN charters. So this is quite different from that.
Do you think the US should be helped?
I think those countries that have the capacity and the will to help the United States will do that and should do that. We have to understand that the situation, of course, in the Middle East and in the Gulf region right now is extremely serious. We have Iran that has attacked somewhere between 10 to 13 different countries with missiles and drones, and that's why I think any de-escalatory measure right now would be very useful. Iran's interest, though, the problem here is that Iran seems to have three interests. One is to cause damage to its neighbors. Two is to maximize the harm on the global economy through the oil price. And the third one is to keep up their current regime.
But how does this de-escalate? First of all, who are the right people or the right person to try and help?
Well, we need a ceasefire. So I'm just wondering whether the Europeans or actually India could get involved. We saw Foreign Minister Jaishankar calling for a ceasefire and negotiations just to calm down the temperature and freeze the situation as it is. The problem in these kinds of situations is when you kind of have three players, Israel, the US and Iran, all with more or less different interests. It's very difficult for them to organize themselves into a peace kind of a situation.
Do you have a clear understanding of what the US is trying to achieve?
I think the original aim, and obviously I don't want to give advice to the US administration, but from what I understand, number one was to shut down the Iranian nuclear program. Number two was to damage their capability in terms of missiles and both launching and defense. Number three were the proxies, so terrorist organizations such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. And number four was regime change. And then, of course, you're going to have to ask the American administration which one of this is more important, which one is going to materialize.
President Stubb, the EU High Representative Kaja Kallas was talking about repurposing the EU's Red Sea naval mission to the Strait of Hormuz. Is this a good idea? Well,
I haven't seen the latest reports on the EU foreign ministers meeting, but that could be one way of helping out. But that is for the EU foreign ministers to decide, and I think they're still sitting as we are having this conversation, so I don't know the outcome.
And I understand you're calling for de-escalation, but how worried are you that this actually escalates, that the conflict widens?
I'm worried because what we used to see, especially after the Cold War, were local conflicts, almost like wars of civil wars. Now we're seeing regional. First we saw Israel, Palestine, then we've seen Russia, Ukraine, and now of course we see Iran and 10 to 13 countries. So of course I'm worried. And to all of my European friends or American friends, I sort of asked the question that how would we feel if there were missiles flying in our region to 13 different countries? Of course, we would be extremely worried. And that is the mindset that I think a lot of the countries in the Gulf region and in the Middle East have, because they didn't want this war. And that's the problem. That's why I think we need to bring down the temperature. The United States military has shown its might. There's no question about that. They've hit X amount of targets quite successfully. But now it's time to please calm down.
There are also media reports that actually Russia was reportedly sharing intelligence with Iran on the location of U.S. forces.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Well, it's super worrying, yes. I wouldn't put it past them. And this is what I try to tell my American friends as well. that, there are two elements of this. One is that Russia is now giving shaheeds back to Iran, with which they can hit American bases. And two, they're giving intelligence about where the American bases are. So basically giving the executive order to kill American soldiers. And I'd be very worried about that. But of course, as a Finn, I'm more worried about the repercussions on the war in Ukraine, because that's in many ways, our war, which we feel very strongly about. And we're seeing now increased oil prices, which basically feed the Russian war machinery. We're seeing the United States lifting sanctions on Russian oil. We're seeing the U.S. giving a waiver to India for buying Russian oil. So everything is linked to everything. And we now need to get back to focus also on Ukraine. That's why we need a ceasefire in Iran.
But is this good or bad news for Ukraine? So if Russia is implicated actually in the war in the Middle East, does it make it more likely that they can't share intelligence with Iran or can't get missiles actually when it comes to Ukraine?
Well, if this was a binary, choice between good and bad, I'd say it's bad because of the oil price. In other words, for Ukraine. But the situation actually on the military front for Ukraine is good. They're actually getting back more territory than what Russia is getting. And obviously the lethality of the Ukrainian war machinery and defense forces is very strong, because in the past 3 months there have been over 90,000 dead Russian soldiers, with much, 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 much less on the Ukrainian side. So from a military perspective, I'm not too worried right now, but from a financial perspective, in other words, feeding the Russian war machinery, I am worried.
What do you say to people who say, well, if the U.S. can act this way in Venezuela and Iran, then actually Russia can act this way in Ukraine?
I think a lot of countries are now working outside the framework of international law. And that's why I have called, for a revamping of the world order, a return back to international institutions, norms and laws. But in order for that to happen, you need a consensus among the 200 nation states of the world. And I have always believed that, in the future it should be the likes of India and others that have a bigger say in this. But right now we're seeing what, a Hobbesian world means, a world where power vacuums emerge and then someone feeds them. For me, diplomacy is always about win-win, and right now we're seeing zero-sum, a lot of transactions and deals, and it doesn't seem to be working.
Does it have to get worse before it gets better?
I hope it wouldn't, but obviously, the fact that we already had a huge war of aggression from Russia to Ukraine, we had a very complicated situation in Gaza. Now we have a full-blown war in the Middle East. It seems to be getting worse before it can get better.
You're also hosting a meeting of the Joint Expeditionary Force in Helsinki next week. I mean, this is basically a regional defense cooperation framework, right, led by the UK. What are you hoping to achieve? Well,
basically, we're 10 countries there. So it's the Nordics and the Baltics, 8, plus then the Netherlands and the UK. And, probably hoping to achieve 3 things. One is what is our focus on the Eastern Front and the Eastern flank? What can we do to together jointly strengthen our military there? Second, North, because of the Arctic. So I think from a security perspective, the key is northern Finland, Sweden and Norway. What can we do there? Now we have actually a training exercise in northern Finland and northern Norway, 25,000 troops. And then thirdly, we kind of want to look at the future of JEF, as we call it, how we can improve sort of regional security in general. So it's a good place also to prepare a little bit the NATO summit that's coming up in Ankara next summer.
Have you asked the Prime Minister of Canada to join the meeting? And should Canada actually join, Jeff?
I don't know if it's public yet, but now it will become public that he might call in.
And do you expect Canada to join this initiative?
I think we'll see. I mean, what we usually do in this group is that, which was founded by the UK, is that we get someone to call in, on the Arctic. We get someone to calling in on the East, and then we see how things go.
I mean, going back to Ukraine, how focused do you think President Trump is on finding a solution for Ukraine, given everything that's going on in the Middle East?
I can't speak for the president himself, but I do sort of sense certain frustrations and impatience with the situation right now, which does worry me. because there are now kind of two fronts, of course, one in Iran where the US is really involved, and then one in Ukraine where the US is mediating. And then anytime there is a situation ongoing where American troops are involved, where the costs are astronomical, then I think the focus is there more than on the peace mediation, unfortunately.
Do you think Vladimir Putin would end, basically keep his side of the bargain?
In which way?
If there is some kind of peace negotiation.
I think what we're seeing right now is Vladimir Putin and Russia not wanting peace and the Ukrainians wanting peace. That's the base case that we work with. I mean, for this year, we kind of have three scenarios. One is that the war continues. The second one is that there's a peace agreement. And the third one is that, one side or the other loses support. We're working on all three scenarios.
President Stubb, when you look at what could end the war quickly in the Middle East, a ceasefire or something like that, I mean, is it the price of oil shooting at $200 or the price of gasoline at $5, like some people say?
Difficult to say. It's probably a combination of the above. Of course, in the U.S., we have midterms coming up that might influence the impact of the war. The second one probably because you have sort of a military approach to this and you have a political, and what has the United States and Israel defined as their military achievement? So if it's getting rid of Iranian nuclear weapons, missiles, whatever the case might be, and they decide, and okay, from a military perspective, Mr. President, we have now won. That could end it. And then from a political perspective, I think it's more about markets, the price of oil, price of gasoline, or a gallon of gas in the U.S., as they say. That might sort of, tip the bucket.
Do you think that, this actually could tip the world economy into a recession or close to?
I think it's too early to say, but I have heard people saying that this could be potentially more serious than COVID. So then we understand the magnitude. Of course, it's different from the oil crisis in 1973 onwards. The premises are different, the flows are different, the energy portfolios of states are different, and of course, the impact on the different regions. So the Straits of Hormuz, they have a bigger impact on Asia than they have on Europe. But to say that we are not, impacted is wrong. No. The U.S. is also impacted. It's about inflation. It could be about interest rates. It's about price of fertilizers. So when you sort of stop 20% of trade in a certain area, it's going to hit all of us in one way or another. And that's why I think it's very important now to get that ceasefire going.
When's the last time you spoke to President Trump?
We speak or message fairly frequently, and I keep them private.
And so you don't have an insight into his state of mind right now or what he's thinking next?
I think we tried to have connections with European leaders, world leaders, with President Trump, and tried to figure out how we can best solve this crisis. I myself, in my capacity as President of Finland, I see myself very much in the back office. So if I can share some information on Ukraine or elsewhere to the President of the U.S. or someone else, I hope I'm useful.
President Stubb, you're also a great student of defense and military might. What has this war so far taught us about? There's also a huge fight between Anthropic and the Pentagon. It does feel like the front lines are now bought through AI. Do you worry about some of those lines being crossed?
I don't. It's not my primary worry, because this is obviously a war where we're not, at least yet, have seen boots on the ground. So it's very much an air attack. So from a military analytical perspective, I am impressed with what the United States and Israel are capable to do, and I'm also positively surprised to see what Iran is able to do. And positively, I don't mean that I agree with it, I disagree with what they're doing. But the bottom line is that we are now moving towards a warfare, which is quite different from what it used to. And I think the best way to describe it is that the beginning of the war between Russia and Ukraine was very much in the trenches and tanks and World War I. And now we've moved into a completely different level where we're seeing airspace and others being dominated by drones, and that brings a new dimension. And then when we add on to that AI, we have to understand that it has changed war and the way in which we conduct it, and we're seeing it in a modern kind of a way. I remember as a young student in the U.S. Watching the Gulf War, And for the first time, the likes of Bloomberg and CNN reporting from the war on rooftops somewhere in the Middle East, and that was mind-boggling. Now you see it in real time, so it does make a difference.
Is it more dangerous?
If we were to move to a world where it was conducted by robots, by AI, by unmanned vehicles, and if we would stick to the rules of law, not to rules of war, not to hit civilian targets, then it would be less dangerous. We would be destroying machines. But of course, the world is different. We see the destruction of civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. We see the destruction of civilian infrastructure in the Middle East as well.